Hello folks, good afternoon to this Friday with the weekend looming. I'm Tim Pinnell from NQA. I head up the Information Assurance Business Unit, and if we've spoken before, hello again, and to those of you I've yet to have the pleasure of meeting, welcome to today's webinar about demystifying business continuity through ISO 22301. But before we get into the webinar, a little bit about NQA. NQA is a global leader in certification with offices in London, Boston, Bangalore, and Shanghai. We specialize in a range of management system standards for certification, which were being conducted remotely, but are, as we return to a new normal, a blended approach. That is a mix of on-site and remote auditing. Now, business continuity falls under the information resilience and risk management banners, but really actually could do with a logo in its own right, perhaps as operational resilience, which I'll be talking about as well in this webinar. And for all of those standards, we offer training services with e-learning, webinars, in-house and pandemic permitting at nationwide locations. And this is me. If you've had the opportunity to listen to any of my webinars about operational resilience, earlier business continuity webinars or information security, then I hope today's webinar provides some new insight of benefit to you. And if this is your first time, welcome. And for all of you, as mass gatherings start to open up, I hope to meet you face to face, perhaps at a conference in the near future. Now we've got 45 minutes, which includes time for Q&A at the end. So please type your questions into the chat box, and which will answer at the end. And as ever, you'll receive a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides. So for today, I'm going to start with a brief overview of 22301 and then go straight into the benefits of it. Now, this isn't a sales pitch. Of course, I'd love you to choose NQA as your UCAS accredited 22301 certification body, but this is about why certified business continuity is a good thing to do, regardless of who your eventual certification body might be. If you have an existing management system, or even if this would be your first one, I'll discuss the commonalities between 22301 and other Annex SL standards, which could represent a saving in time and effort if you decide to build an integrated management system. And then the meat of the subject, how to operate and implement a business continuity management system. On the way, I'll present some examples, although I have to be careful not to stray too far into what could be consultancy. I wouldn't want to audit my own homework eventually. But I'm going to start with the context for business continuity. And again, if you've seen my earlier webinars, you'll be familiar with the operational resilience context. Now, operational resilience means different things to different people. In the Army, for example, it's a multifaceted thing, but one that is developed through much hard-won experience over the centuries. Hygiene is a case in point. The military are terrified of diarrhea, not of the effect on the individual, but on the overall fighting capability if it spreads. An army can't fight from the toilet seat, which is why COVID has had a limited impact on the armed services, because they're good at managing unintended change and dealing with ambiguity, especially fluid situations such as diarrhea. The key thing to note here is that people are a resource, and having the right people available at the right time is important for a business continuity response. Or is the loss of key personnel a business continuity risk? So what are the characteristics of operational resilience? Well, it's a combination of business continuity management, health and safety, security, disaster recovery management, environmental management, and most importantly, organizational culture. And yet 53% of UK organizations don't have adequate capabilities to cope with disruption. Surveys suggest that in a typical year, organizations will have some form of disruption. 5% have experienced a fire, 25% IT issues, 25% telecoms issues, and 28% of organizations have suffered extreme weather events. Note that those don't have to be big incidents, it's just that stuff happens and organizations have to deal with it, but some are better than others. During the Fukushima reactor disaster in Japan, I was an on-call civil resilience officer. We were concerned that we might have to evacuate staff from Tokyo, but we had major Japanese customers who depended upon us as a supplier. In the end, our duty of care prevailed, and we decided to evacuate the staff and try to run the services remotely from another country. So we counted up the staff and started the process of chartering a plane. But of course, the staff have families at home, so they had to come as well. But you can't leave the grandparents behind, and then you can't leave the maid. And the maid has a family, and the maid has grandparents, and so on. And what about the beloved pets? So who was going to be brave enough to draw the line? Well, in the end, the employees settled it for us. They refused to leave as a matter of honour, and some even camped down in the offices to ensure continuity of service. The question is then, did the organisation exhibit the characteristics of an operationally resilient organisation, which are top-level commitment, preparedness, and then flexibility, it's coping with those changing circumstances, awareness of issues, and a part of that is the opacity. It's awareness of its own limitations and how close it is to those. And then also just culture, the ability to report issues in an open manner within the organisation. And then a risk-based culture, and we'll touch on this later in the webinar when we see how important understanding risk and making risk-based decisions. These are all key aspects of specifically business continuity. If your organisation has these, then you're already well on the way. But it's not just about 22301. I want to place all these standards in the business continuity context. All organisations need to ensure resilient strategies are integrated into their activities, particularly business critical functions and processes. Just like national governments have mechanisms to respond to crises and the unforeseen, each organisation that desires to continue through adversity must also have the same. And as you'd expect me to say, the plan, do, check, act cycle is fundamental to this. Annex SL, which we'll also touch on again, is that homogenization that means the following standards on screen complement each other during an organization's journey towards operational resilience. But we'll start with 22301. Detailed in this standard are the requirement to conduct a business impact analysis and a risk assessment, which again we're going to look at. And this helps identify potential disruption scenarios and the critical processes that need a recovery strategy. And it also helps determine what level of response and recovery capabilities are required. That's how long can we cope with the disruption? What alternatives are there? What resources do we need to recover? And to what level do we need to recover? And by when do we need to recover? And who do we need to tell? Then a strategy and the implementation process follow, from which can help an organization to act and then ultimately recover. 27001, as I'm sure you know, is an information security standard. And a key tenet of information security is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the standard says conduct a risk assessment, much like 22301, and identify the risks to your information assets. And then it requires you to have an incident management process, which has very similar requirements to 22301 for managing business continuity incidents in the event of, say, a cyber breach. But it also requires you to have information security continuity planning in the event of a crisis or a disaster. And like 22301, it requires you to test and practice your continuity processes. If your organization processes personal data, then ensuring compliance with national legislation and GDPR is vital, so you can extend your 27001 to include data privacy compliance through the implementation of ISO 27701. And here's a top tip for you. The ICO really likes organizations that have implemented a security standard. Now, 27701 doesn't have specific requirements for continuity, but it extends almost all of 27001 controls, including continuity, to include personal data. And then you've got 27017, information security for cloud service providers, also extends 27001 controls and has extra requirements for incident management. And why 14001? Well, regulators expect organizations to consider their societal impact. Similarly, a responsible organisation should also consider the implications of their continuity plans on the environment. It has a section entitled Emergency Preparedness and Response. And again, the requirements look very similar to other standards, as does 45,001 for occupational health and safety. And finally, 20,000 IT service management has a section on service continuity management. What is common throughout these standards is the risk assessment and the planning. They all require organisations to estimate what can go wrong, how it will hurt them, and then to plan for how long they can tolerate it, what they need to do to recover, what they need to recover, and who do they need to tell. It's also worth pointing out that all of these standards direct you to consider your supply chain to varying degrees. And indeed, if I were to add 9001 quality management into the mix, then supply dependency really is called out. That begs the question about how do organisations seek assurance that their suppliers are operationally resilient? Well, of course, I'd recommend these management system standards because it's often very difficult for organisations to conduct supplier audits, and I'll come back to this. Now, there will be very few organisations that will implement all of these standards, but my point is that by implementing any one of them, then they're already on the way to thinking about continuity. And implementing 22301 in conjunction with any one of them that they may already have places an organisation in a strong position to demonstrate resilience and their continued viability. So yeah, let's have a look at the benefits of 22301. Well, in terms of leadership commitment to resilience, it demonstrates management commitment in an overall risk management context with visible evidence to the organization's stakeholders. And it encourages clear communications on what employees need to do to recover from an incident, and it supports cross-department and cross-organization coordination. And it also supports compliance with the expectations or meeting the expectations of regulators, insurers, business partners, and other key stakeholders. From a reputational point of view, then it clearly gives you an advantage over less resilient competitors. Your reputation is maintained or even improved through demonstrating a professional approach to managing disruption. And positive messaging communicated to the media and stakeholders in crisis conditions comes out of implementing 22301. And for protection and recovery, there's that identification and the understanding of the most valuable and critical business processes and the impact of their disruption. The timely and orderly responses to incidents and business disruptions to continue business operations at acceptable predefined levels as promised in contracts or agreements. And it demonstrates credible responses through scenario-based exercising. And I really will come back to exercising later. And of course, it increases the survival chance of both the organization and the employees' jobs and other dependencies as well. It's not just about the organization. And of course, it gives you those increased levels of resilience and recovery capability. And again, the continued survivability of the organization. And then from a financial point of view, it improves your risk profile when renewing your insurance policy, which could result in reduced insurance premiums, which I have heard of anecdotally. And then it can significantly reduce the financial impact of incidents or disruption or even under disaster because it's being managed correctly and you've prepared for that and you've anticipated those impacts up front. And of course, if you're managing and logging everything within an incident, then it's providing evidence to support financial claims. So, okay, let's have a more detailed look at 22301. I'm shamelessly reading from the standard itself because I can't think of another way of putting it better. It says, the standard develops business continuity appropriate to the amount and type of impact that the organization may or may not accept following a disruption. May or may not accept. I'm going to come back to this point when we get to business impact analysis. So it requires a business continuity management system. That's a BCMS. And that provides a framework for understanding an organization's business continuity needs, the processes and capabilities required for response structures in the event of an incident. And as you'd expect from a management system, you've got monitoring, you've got review and continual improvement. And again, as per Annex SL standards, it requires a policy. That is a business continuity policy. You need people who are competent and a whole bunch of processes for planning, policy, implementation and operation, performance assessment and management review. And there's a set of mandatory documentation, which I'll show at the end. Now, as I've mentioned before, 22301 is an Annex SL standard, and Annex SL is that standardized structure which most ISO management system standards have adopted. This means that all Annex L standards have very similar structures. You've got context, leadership, planning and support, performance evaluation and continual improvement, which have very few differences between it and the other standards such as 9001 and 14001. Operation is where 22301 differs, as we'll see, and where the rest of this webinar concentrates. You'll still need to plan, implement and control the business continuity processes, but with very specific requirements. You can download this comparison tool from the NQA website. You can see that each standard follows the Annex SL clause structuring. 4 is the context of the organization, 5 is the leadership, and so on. And then see the commonalities in the sub-clauses, highlighted in the horizontal red boxes. And there really is little difference apart from the context of the standard. But then here we can see the differences in clause 8. If clauses 4 to 7 and 9 to 10 are the heart of the management system, clause 8 is really where the business continuity work is taking place. Hopefully now I've persuaded you that 22301 could be a crucial component in your organization's resilience. So let's have a look at it by going through the clause 8 sub-clauses. So operation, the first thing, plan, implement and control the processes need to meet the requirements of the standard. And included within that, we mustn't forget outsourced processes and supply chain control. I also run webinars on supply chain assurance if you're interested. The standard requires criteria for operating these processes to ensure they're operating within a defined envelope, without which it's going to be difficult to measure their performance. Indeed, the standard does state, keep documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned. The takeaway from this clause is that you must control your business continuity processes. It makes sense, indeed it's obvious, isn't it? But in the heat of the moment, when a disruption has got everyone in a flap, poorly defined processes or criteria can make things more difficult. So therefore, make sure all changes are controlled. And this is one of the areas where the management system framework, that is your BCMS, can help you control that. If you're not used to business continuity, then some of the terminology may appear daunting. But really, the business impact analysis can be boiled down to these 4 steps. The first is the most important and is where you must know the organization. Identifying the key activities is the most important activity for a BCMS. It's harder for large organizations, but it's key to concentrating on what matters most. What are your key activities? These are often viewed in a process context. And to draw from 9001, you've got inputs which are transformed to produce outputs. Identifying the key activities in one or more processes and then listing them in priority order is your starting point. Looking at process dependencies may help you identify critical failures or choke points. And of course, you should have already defined your scope in clause 4, which will concentrate your focus here. If, say, you're a metal products manufacturer, then your HR function may not be a key activity. Then the impact of those disruptions to those activities over time. What are the kinds of events that could disrupt operations? Fuel strikes, power failures, CO2 shortages, for example, key personnel sickness. They may well be unique to the organization and some could be generic. And then how long can you tolerate those disruptions before they become unacceptable? This is your maximum tolerable period of disruption. For example, if you have a critical machine failure that stops you manufacturing, how long is it before not getting product out of the door is costing you? So then you define your recovery time objective and note that this is not just the time frame for restoring service, but to what level. Do you really need to be back to 100%, or will 50% be initially sufficient? Would a lower level of recovery be quicker and buy you time? Then what are all the activities and resources, both internally and externally, needed for the key activities? Knowing this helps you plan. The risk assessment is the next step, where you assess the likelihood of the disruption and the impact to produce a risk score. When you have a risk score, you can decide what your risk appetite is. What levels of risk will your organization tolerate? Assessing the likelihood can be difficult, especially if things haven't gone wrong before. Now, we don't have the Met Office's supercomputers to work out the future, but apply common sense. Just don't go for the middle ground. It might happen, it might not happen, because that won't help decision making. And of course, NQA run a very good course on risk assessment. When you know what your risks are, you start to design strategies and solutions to mitigate the risks. Now, you've got choices at this point. Will you treat the risks with business continuity plans? Will you tolerate the risks, that is, do nothing? Or will you transfer the risk, perhaps to your insurers? Note that recently, organizations that have lost their data due to ransomware attacks have found that sometimes their insurers are not paying up, so read the small print. I'm assuming that you're not going to terminate the processes affected by the risks, that is, stop doing them altogether, but you could. The assumption here is that you're going to treat the risks with strategies and solutions. I can't emphasize enough that you have business conversations with the bean counters and top management. Talk to them in their language about what could go wrong: sales, reputation, liquidity, recovery, share price, the costs associated with business continuity solutions. Some strategies are quite simple in principle, but more involved in practice. I mean, COVID caused a rush to home working, but not every organization had the remote access infrastructure to adequately support it. So the solutions should be carefully thought through and checked against the business impact analysis. And then all the required resources are tactically factored into your strategies, and you'll test them when you get to the exercise phase. Well, business continuity procedures, and the challenge here is to have procedures that are specific. There's no place for ambiguity in a high-tempo, high-pressure situation, yet they might need to be sufficiently general to cope with more than one circumstance. In simplest terms, one of the first steps might be to call a specific person to invoke the plan. The important thing is that the procedures focus on the incident and that the appropriate people have defined roles and responsibilities. There is nothing worse than a bunch of senior managers who each think they are in charge. And indeed, it's a mature organization that appoints an experienced but possibly junior person with the power to manage the disruption and then the recovery. Within that, structure is so important. Well-meaning vigilantes who start hairs running cause confusion and delay recovery, sometimes incurring additional cost. This means that people in scope of the plans must know who is responsible, which leads to communication. Possibly the most important factor in managing and recovery is controlling the message. Comms should be managed by a single source which feeds internal and external comms. It should be in a timely manner, both up and down the management chain. And customers shouldn't have to learn that something has gone wrong from someone else's Twitter feed. Prevent rumors, shut down the grapevine, and supply authorized communications only. Now, business continuity plans are hard, especially if you've not written them before. But think them through step by step, using the strategies you developed earlier as the framework. Plans are like a good book, with a beginning, middle, and end. And sometimes actually you start at the end and work backwards. But they should detail the who, the what, how, and how much, and by when, and of course where. Many organizations operate playbooks, which are available to appropriate personnel, most recently electronically, but sometimes in mini printed format. And don't forget the process for standing down the plan. What are the circumstances when people can be told to close the playbook, and who has the authority to make that call? Exercise program. Exercise, exercise, and exercise. Did I say exercise? Exercising your plans is the most important activity after communications. Too many organizations leave their plans to gather dust. It's only by exercising them that you learn whether or not they're fit for purpose. And it is the best way, short of an actual incident, of reminding people what they must do. There are different types of exercises, from desktop paper exercise to full-blown shutdown of processes. But I'm sorry, but desktop exercising on its own just isn't sufficient. It's a starting point from which you can move to more realistic exercising. But it just won't tell you all you need to know about your plans. I've seen too many organizations just do desktop exercising. Your program of exercises should provide sufficient coverage of your disruption risks, and you should be satisfied that they're adequate. Choosing scenarios can be difficult, particularly ensuring full engagement of key stakeholders. I once ran a day-long exercise for a CEO who insisted that all the directors were in the boardroom, or war room as they called it. But the exercise only really involved the IT and customer services directors. The CTO, the CFO, and the marketing director decided at the end of the day that business continuity had nothing to do with them. So that was a top management leadership failure. And then finally, an oft neglected part of exercising is the post-incident review and then implementing the findings. It is, and it must be, an iterative process. Fortunately, a business continuity management system ensures this happens. And closing down clause 8, we've got this evaluation of documentation and capabilities. Now, this is an odd control that doesn't really have an equivalent in other related standards. And to me, it really is a repeat of the PDCA cycle, a bit like the performance evaluation. But the standout thing for me is about evaluating suppliers and partners. As I mentioned earlier, how do you do that? If Microsoft is a supplier, then you can't evaluate them, say, on site, but they will have published information that you can use for assurance purposes. Depending on the size of your organization, you might not be in a position to audit your suppliers. But as you'd expect, an organization with 22301 certification, relevant to the services you take from them, should give you a warm feeling. And as I say in my supplier assurance webinar, have regular conversations with your suppliers, develop a relationship, and keep them close. I've put this slide here almost by way of a summary, if you like. When building your BCMS, these are steps and the main outputs of those steps. It's not exhaustive, but it is practically clause 8 on a slide. And I promised a list of mandatory documentation. Here it is. I'll leave it on screen for a moment, and then we're going to move to questions, because that has completed the canter through 22301. And notice as well that these mandatory documents are not just for clause 8, they are for the entire management system. So there we go. I'm going to open up the question box and have a look. Hi David, welcome. Now, Muhammad, you've asked a question which I've had before, and I think it's everybody asks that. What do we have to handle first, the business impact analysis or the risk assessment? They are listed in that order in the standard, but every consultant and auditor I've had conversations with have said it doesn't matter. You can do them in either order. My preference, because I've got more of a security background, is that I probably do the risk assessment first, but there is no requirement to do them in a particular order. It really does depend on what your organization requires. Okay, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box. Avril, hi, any tips for when a contracted supply you didn't select is unhelpful? A contracted supply you didn't select is unhelpful. Quite often, and sadly, it boils down to the contract and the extent to which you've got a set of measures or KPIs you can hold them to account. In a supply chain, it is really difficult, and you've seen all the recent difficulties with driver shortages, CO2 shortages, raw material shortages, and gas prices affecting everything. The key thing about 22301 is that when you're doing your business impact analysis, you're looking at these key processes and the resources and activities needed to support them. Now, if you've got a critical supplier in that and they are not cooperating in terms of perhaps getting information out of them about what their business continuity measures are or how they can support you and your business continuity, then you're absolutely right. You've answered your own question. Treat them as a high risk. Of course, then if you treat them as a high risk, you've got to then decide what strategies or solutions you want to put in place to address that risk. Assuming you want to treat it, of course, you could, of course, just transfer it to your insurers. So yeah, treat them as a high risk, but then work out what you want to do. In the supply chain insurance webinar, I often talk about diversification and having other suppliers. That's not always easy to do though, because you've got to keep putting business to all the suppliers. But yes, you're absolutely right. I would treat them as a high risk. Mohammed, when creating a BCP, do we have to consider the type of disaster or disruption? Absolutely, you have to consider the type of disaster or disruption, but that will have come out of your risk assessment. You'll have considered the types of risks that your organization might suffer and what could cause those risks. It could be a disaster or a disruption. That then feeds into your plan. So, for example, if you had a ransomware attack and you've lost the data that you need to process on, that could be a very different type of plan to deal with that compared to a fire, for example. So yes. And then Pawanto, how to prevent the risk of business during the pandemic period. What's been really interesting that me and my colleague, fellow auditors have seen, and certainly some of our consultants have seen during the pandemic, is that many organizations rush to implement home working, and we're trying to rapidly build remote access infrastructures or just dumping everything on Microsoft or whatnot. And then saying, well, actually, that was their business continuity plan. We don't think that's the case. We think that many organizations implemented remote working as a consequence of the pandemic and not a consequence of their plan. Many people had in plans that they could send people to work from home, but they never considered the entire organization going working from home. So, and it's interesting because about 10 years ago, I wrote the pandemic business continuity plan for a very large telecoms company in South America. So this is not new. What is coming out of this is a whole bunch of lessons learned. So what I would suggest to you is, in maybe 6 months to a year's time, there'll be a lot of analysis, post-pandemic analysis about what can organizations have done and learned from. I'll certainly be learning from that and factoring that into the auditing of clients, and I'm sure consultants will as well. So keep an eye on that. Mohammed, again, thanks very much. Can we make it regardless of the type of disaster? In other words, make the BCP general to cope with any type of disruptions. It is certainly the case that it would be an enormous task to try and have a plan for every type of disruption. That's not reasonable. Certainly, the greater the size of the organization, the more plans you're going to have. Many organizations have a general set of plans which can be evoked regardless of the type of disruption. And then they bring together subject matter experts to manage that plan and make decisions depending on the type of disruption. A lot of that is dependent on what industry you're in or what services you're providing to your customers as well. So it really will vary depending on where you are. Anna, isn't there a minimum team designates that will ensure the organization has identified all the relevant role players within the organization? Again, that's going to be very specific to the context of the organization. That is, who do you bring together to A, do your business continuity planning, and then secondly, who would you have as part of your disaster recovery team or your incident management team? It may well be that you're going to have perhaps someone from IT, maybe someone from production operations, probably someone from customer service. You may well get a lawyer in there as well, someone from the communications and marketing team to handle the messages. So when you're sitting down to start doing your planning and working out your risks, think about the risks, who you're going to need to involve to manage those risks, and then who you need to involve indeed for post-recovery as well. That will help inform who you need in the different teams and roles. So it really will vary depending on what you're doing. Anthony has said, it's a good idea to use 9001 QMS processes. Oh, is it a good idea as a starting point for a business impact analysis? Anthony, absolutely. And I did make the point in the webinar about 9001, you've got a bunch of inputs which are transformed to produce a bunch of outputs. Well, those those transformation processes are often your key activities which the organization depends upon. And so having 9001 processes identified in place will really, really help you for that business impact analysis. And although I talk about those transformation processes, of course, don't forget the inputs. You've got all of your supply chain delivering your inputs, and then you've got the outputs have to be delivered to your customers as well. It's no good having everything perfect, but actually you can't deliver them to your customers. So those could be critical points as well. But 9001 is I think, a great starting point. And I really do believe, and I've said this before, that 9001 and 22301 are probably really good pairings of standards. Stephanie, we have site-specific plans for teams who operate there, but we also have plans for widespread disruption across all sites teams, such as cybersecurity issue. Do you think this approach works? Yes, I worked previously for a very large organization. They had a central business continuity and incident management function, but then there were specific plans that could be invoked for specific locations or functions. So the business continuity management team would come together. They would say, it's happening at location X, therefore they need to invoke their plans. And we will maintain that high level oversight of the incident management. I've seen it work. If it's properly coordinated, then yes, do it. But ever, I go back to that point, exercise it, exercise it. Essentially, you're asking me if this approach works. I've seen it work, but I know that that approach I've seen was exercised properly. It's hard to exercise properly because sometimes that actually means you do have to switch something off, or you do have to transfer on an operation to a standby site or a fallback location, what have you. And it's a brave organization that does that. But it's only by doing it, you really do know whether your plans work. And Puanto, could we integrate this into ISO 9001 directly? Sorry, my managing director just called me there. The answer is yes. I think that I was answering that question to Anthony. I would recommend, though, that you did it as an integrated management system. 9001 doesn't have the controls that you would have or the requirements that 22301 have. So I would do them together as an integrated management system. I hope that answers the question. Thanks very much. Muhammad, in exercising the BCP, what are the metrics that we have to monitor to measure the success of the implementation? I can't tell you what your metrics are. You need to work those out as part of your planning. So when you look at your recovery targets and your tolerable periods of disruption, they will start to inform the plan. So if you need to get 50% of your operation up and running within 24 hours, and your exercising shows that you're not able to achieve that, then that is a measure of either success or failure. So it does come down to that planning. So when you're exercising the BCP, you should define those metrics in the planning in the first place. And if you can't find them, you meet them, then they're wrong, or something else is wrong, and you have to go back and redo it. And that's the beauty of management system frameworks, is that it provides that cyclical framework for you to plan what you're going to do, test it and check it and change it, and keep doing that all the time. And when we come in to audit you, that's what we're looking for. Is it possible to limit the scope of the certificate to just the customer services and kit areas? Scope is really, really important, particularly depending on the size of the organization. But before you determine the scope, again, go back to what's important to the organization, what matters most, what we're looking at in terms of the viability of the organization. What do we need to continue to get out of the door? So if it's customer services, for example, if they're the key thing to the organization, then yes, definitely you could constrain the scope to that. And I mentioned in the webinar that perhaps the HR function isn't the most important thing. You could probably cope with disruption to the HR department for a couple of weeks, for example. However, payroll, maybe not. You know, if a disruption happens at the end of the month, maybe the payroll actually becomes important, so you might have to be a bit dynamic. But yeah, very much consider the scope of your certification carefully, The larger the organization, then the harder it is to manage, and you don't want to boil the ocean. Yeah. Okay. If there are no more questions, then thank you very much indeed for joining. I hope you found it useful. I've enjoyed answering your questions. It's great to get so many questions because you're asking the questions that many other customers might ask, and it's great to just test those answers. I hope you found it interesting. As a reminder, you'll get a recording and a copy of the slides as well. Please visit the NQA website for more information about our resources, webinars, blogs, events and downloads, and of course, our certification and training services. Thanks very much. Bye-bye now.